On a scorching afternoon in a dusty frontier town, a starving cowboy boy made a choice that would change his life forever. When an elderly couple faced humiliation for losing their money, young Jesse Carter gave up his last coin, the only thing standing between his family and ruin. He didn't know that the strangers he saved were hiding a secret worth more than all the gold in the territory. By dawn, the richest rancher in Arizona would be standing at his door with an offer that seemed too impossible to be true. This is the story of how one act of kindness in the Wild West turned a boy with nothing into someone who had everything to gain. The air inside the Silver Spur Saloon and dining hall was thick with the smell of roasted beef, cornbread, and tobacco smoke. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight that pierced through the gap-toothed wooden slats of the walls. The floor creaked beneath heavy boots as cowboys, ranch hands, and travelers moved between tables carved with initials and stained with years of spilled whiskey and gravy. Jesse Carter sat near the swinging doors, his hat pulled low over his sun-darkened face, his stomach twisting into knots so tight he thought he might double over. The wooden menu in front of him might as well have been written in a foreign tongue. His eyes glazed over the words, but all he could focus on was the sizzle of steak hitting a hot iron skillet behind the kitchen door, the smell of fresh biscuits being pulled from the oven, the sight of a plate piled high with beans and salt pork passing right by his table. His fingers twitched toward the single silver dollar tucked deep in his vest pocket. It was all he had left, the last piece of money he'd earned mucking stalls and mending fences for a ranch on the outskirts of Dust Creek. That dollar wasn't his to spend. It belonged to his mother, Martha, who'd been working herself to the bone, trying to keep their small homestead from falling into the hands of the bank. 15 years old, and Jesse already knew what it meant to go without. He swallowed hard, folded the menu shut, and pushed it aside. He could wait. He had to. He was here to meet Tommy Webb, his friend who worked in the back kitchen, cleaning pots and hauling water. Tommy's shift would be done soon, and then they'd walk back together through the dry heat of the Arizona Territory, past the hitching posts and the general store, back to the edges of town where life was harder and hope was thin. Jesse's gaze drifted across the room. At a corner table near the bar, a well-dressed couple counted out coins with ease, laughing over something one of them had said. Their clothes were clean, their hands soft. Jesse looked away, jaw tight. Then the shouting started. A voice cracked through the low hum of conversation like a whip splitting air. "If you ain't got money, you don't eat here." Jesse's head snapped up. At the far end of the dining hall, near the stone fireplace, a table had gone deathly silent. A young waitress stood frozen, her tray clutched against her chest. And towering over two elderly customers was Ezra Blackwood, the owner of the Silver Spur, a barrel-chested man with a thick black beard and eyes like cold iron. The couple looked small beneath his shadow. The woman, gray-haired and thin, clutched at the edges of her shawl. The man beside her, his weathered hands trembling, patted down his pockets again and again as if hoping the money might suddenly appear. Ezra's lip curled into a sneer. "Let me guess," he said loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You thought you'd sit down, order yourselves a nice meal, and nobody'd notice you couldn't pay for it?" The woman's voice shook. "Sir, please. We had our money. We must have dropped it outside. Just give us a moment to look." Ezra cut her off with a bark of laughter. "Yeah, sure. And I'm the King of England." Jesse's hands curled into fists on the table. His heart pounded in his chest. No one else moved. No one else said a word. Ezra's voice grew louder, meaner, feeding off the silence of the room like a predator circling wounded prey. "I've heard every excuse in the book," he said, his boots thudding against the wooden floor as he stepped closer to the elderly couple. "First it's I lost my wallet. Then it's, oh please, let me work it off sweeping floors. Like this is some kind of charity house." His eyes swept across the room, looking for approval, for agreement. A few patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One man in a black Stetson shook his head and muttered something under his breath. A woman near the window dabbed her lips with a cloth napkin and turned her gaze toward the dusty street outside. The old man, his face lined deep with age and sun, let out a shaky breath. "It must have fallen out when we climbed down from the stagecoach, Rose." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I thought I had it." Rose, the woman beside him, blinked rapidly, her fingers knotting together in her lap. "Please, sir," she said again, quieter now, almost pleading. "We're not trying to cheat you. We'll find it. Just let us step outside." Ezra leaned down, his shadow swallowing them whole. "You hear that, folks?" he called out to the room. "They just need a moment." He let the word hang in the air, dripping with mockery. "Maybe we should all reach into our pockets and help 'em out, huh?" He turned back to the couple, dropping his voice to something low and vicious, something only those closest could hear. "You think because you're old I won't throw you out on your backsides? Think again." That was it. Jesse shot to his feet. The legs of his chair scraped loud against the floor, cutting through the thick tension like a knife. Heads turned, eyes landed on him. The weight of a dozen stares pressed down on his shoulders, but he didn't care. His boots hit the floorboards hard as he crossed the room, his jaw set, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't think, he just moved. He stopped between Ezra and the couple, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his voice steady despite the fire burning inside him. "That's enough." Ezra straightened, his thick brows pulling together as he looked Jesse up and down. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled. "Look who we got here. A little hero." He crossed his arms over his barrel chest. "What are you going to do, boy? Give me a lecture on manners?" Jesse held his ground. "You don't need to talk to them like that. They're not trying to cheat you." Ezra's smile twisted into something crueler. "Oh, you know that for sure, do you?" He tilted his head, studying Jesse like he was something amusing, something small. "Tell me something, kid. You planning to pay for their meal? 'Cause if not, I suggest you sit yourself back down and let the grown men handle this." The room went silent. Jesse's heart hammered against his ribs. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into his vest pocket. His fingers closed around the single silver dollar, the one he'd been saving, the one that was supposed to go to his mother, the one that meant the difference between keeping the roof over their heads or losing everything. He pulled it out. The coin caught the light as he held it up, then slapped it down onto the counter with a sharp metallic clink that echoed through the room. "Now, you don't have an excuse." Ezra stared at the coin. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or irritation. Then he let out a slow, exaggerated sigh, swiped the dollar off the counter, and shoved it into his cash box. "Fine," he muttered, "but don't come crying to me when they play you for a fool." Jesse didn't even look at him. He turned to Rose and Samuel, their eyes wide, their expressions unreadable. Rose's voice trembled. "Young man, you didn't have to do that." Jesse gave them a small, tired smile. "Everyone needs help sometimes." Rose's hands trembled as she reached across the table, her weathered fingers brushing against Jesse's arm. Her eyes were glassy, filled with something Jesse couldn't quite name. Gratitude, guilt, maybe both. "We could have figured something out," Samuel said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You shouldn't have—" "It's done," Jesse said, cutting him off gently. He didn't want to hear it, didn't want them to feel worse than they already did. Just enjoy your meal. Rose fumbled in her small cloth purse, pulling out a worn piece of paper and a stub of pencil. Her hands shook as she scribbled something down, then pressed it into Jesse's palm. "Please," she whispered, "if you ever need anything, anything at all, you come find us. Promise me." Jesse looked down at the paper. An address. Somewhere outside of town. He nodded. folding it carefully and tucking it into his pocket beside the empty space where his dollar used to be. Samuel tipped his hat, his jaw tight, his eyes red-rimmed. "Thank you, son." Jesse nodded again, then turned and walked back to his table. His legs felt heavy, his chest felt hollow. The room slowly came back to life around him. Forks scraped against plates. Conversations resumed in low murmurs. But Jesse just sat there, staring at the grain of the wooden table, his hands flat against the surface, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settle over him like a stone. He'd done the right thing, he knew that. If he'd walked away, if he'd let Ezra humiliate them, he wouldn't have been able to live with himself. But that didn't make it any easier. That silver dollar had been everything, and now it was gone. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread drifted past him again, mocking him, reminding him of what he couldn't have. His stomach twisted into a knot so tight it hurt. He sat there for another 20 minutes, waiting for Tommy, trying not to think about the conversation he'd have to have with his mother when he got home, trying not to think about the look on her face when he told her he had nothing. Then something caught his eye. He'd been shifting in his seat, adjusting his hat, when his boot knocked against the table leg. A napkin fluttered to the floor. Jesse sighed and bent down to grab it, and that's when he saw it. Tucked beneath the bench where Rose and Samuel had been sitting, half hidden in shadow, was a small leather pouch. Jesse froze. His pulse quickened as he reached out, fingers brushing against worn, sun-faded leather. He pulled it free and opened it. Inside were bills, more than he'd ever seen in one place, and a small tin-type photograph, Rose and Samuel, younger, standing in front of a sprawling ranch house with white painted fences stretching into the distance. His breath caught in his throat. It was theirs. Jesse shot to his feet, his heart pounding. He scanned the room, searching for them, but they were gone. The table was empty. The door was swinging gently on its hinges. He cursed under his breath and bolted for the entrance, shoving through the swinging doors and out onto the dusty street. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the wooden boardwalk. Horses were tied to hitching posts, their tails flicking at flies. A stagecoach rattled past, kicking up dust, but Rose and Samuel were nowhere to be seen. Jesse turned left, then right, squinting against the glare. His hands tightened around the pouch. They needed this. He had to get it back to them. But they were gone. His mind raced. He couldn't just leave it at the saloon. Ezra would pocket it without a second thought. He couldn't take it home. What if they came looking for it and couldn't find him? Then it hit him. The sheriff's office. Jesse turned on his heel and started walking fast, almost running, his boots kicking up dust as he headed down Main Street toward the small wooden building with the faded star painted on the door. He had to do this right. The sheriff's office was small and dim, the air inside heavy with the smell of old leather, gun oil, and stale coffee. A single lantern flickered on the desk, casting long shadows across the rough wooden walls. Jesse stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him, and approached the desk, where a deputy sat hunched over a stack of wanted posters. The deputy looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing as they swept over Jesse. Dusty clothes, worn boots, hat pulled low. He set down his pencil and leaned back in his chair. "Something I can help you with, boy." Jesse stepped forward and set the leather pouch on the desk. "I found this. It belongs to an elderly couple, Samuel and Rose. They were at the Silver Spur, but I lost them before I could return it." The deputy stared at the pouch, then at Jesse. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes made Jesse's stomach tighten. "You sure you didn't just find this lying in the street somewhere?" The words stung more than Jesse wanted to admit. He kept his voice steady. "I watched them lose it. I know it's theirs." The deputy exhaled slowly through his nose, then picked up the pouch and opened it. His eyebrows lifted slightly at the contents. He pulled out the tintype, studied it for a moment, then set it back inside. "All right," he said finally, his tone flat. "We'll try to contact them if there's information in here. What's your name? Got a way for them to reach you if they want to thank you?" Jesse hesitated for just a heartbeat, then gave his name and told the deputy where he lived. The Carter homestead, a mile outside of town on the eastern road. The deputy scribbled it down without looking up. "We'll handle it from here." That was it. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just a dismissal. Jesse stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked back out into the fading light of late afternoon. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and red. The heat was finally starting to break, but Jesse barely noticed. He shoved his hands into his pockets and started the long walk home, his boots dragging through the dust. The weight in his chest grew heavier with every step. By the time he reached the Carter homestead, the sky had turned to deep purple. The small wooden house sat at the edge of a dry, cracked field, its paint long since peeled away by wind and sun. A single horse stood in the lean-to beside the house, its head low, too tired to do much more than flick its ears at the sound of Jesse's footsteps. Inside, the house was dim and quiet. A single oil lamp burned on the kitchen table, casting a weak circle of light. His mother, Martha, stood at the stove, stirring a pot of thin stew. The smell of it filled the small room, mostly water and a few carrots, maybe a potato if they were lucky. She looked up as Jesse walked in, her face lined with exhaustion, her eyes searching his. "Baby," she said softly, "what's wrong?" Jesse stopped in the doorway. For a moment he thought about lying, thought about saying it was nothing, that everything was fine, but the words stuck in his throat. He crossed the room and sat down heavily at the table, and then, slowly, he told her everything. Martha listened in silence, her hands still on the wooden spoon, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she set the spoon down and came to sit across from him. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Then she reached across the table and rested her hand over his. "You gave them all your money," she said quietly. Jesse nodded, his throat tight. "I'm sorry, Mama. I know we needed it. I couldn't." "Baby, stop." Her voice was gentle but firm. She squeezed his hand. "You did the right thing." Jesse looked up at her, his eyes stinging. "But now we've got nothing." Martha smiled, tired but warm. "We've got each other. And we've got a son who knows what it means to be good. That's worth more than any coin." Jesse wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that doing the right thing was enough, that kindness could somehow fill the empty spaces where money should have been. But as he lay in his small bed that night, staring up at the wooden beams of the ceiling, reality pressed down on him like a heavy weight. The house creaked and settled around him. Outside, the wind whispered through the dry grass, rattling the loose boards of the lean-to. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Jesse closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. He thought about his mother's face when she'd tried to smile at him across the table. He thought about the thinness of the stew she'd served, how she'd given him most of it and claimed she wasn't hungry. He thought about the stack of papers on the small desk in the corner, notices from the bank, letters with red stamps, warnings they couldn't ignore much longer. That silver dollar had been their last hope, and he'd given it away. Morning came too soon. The sun barely crested the horizon when Jesse dragged himself out of bed, his body aching from a restless night. He dressed quietly, pulling on his worn shirt and vest, tugging his boots over his feet. The house was silent, except for the soft sounds of his mother moving in the kitchen. When he stepped into the main room, Martha was already at the stove, coaxing life out of their dwindling supply of kindling. A pot of weak coffee sat on the table beside 2 tin cups. No food. They'd eaten the last of the stew the night before. Jesse sat down, wrapping his hands around the cup, even though it barely held any warmth. His mother joined him, her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't meet his eyes. They sat in silence, the unspoken truth hanging between them like smoke. Then came the knock, sharp, firm, unexpected. Jesse's head snapped up, his heart lurching in his chest. Martha's brow furrowed as she rose from her chair, wiping her hands on her apron. It was early, too early for visitors, too early for good news. A cold thread of unease wound through Jessie's gut as she moved toward the door. "Who is it?" Martha called out, her voice cautious. A pause. Then a familiar voice, muffled through the wood. "It's Samuel and Rose, ma'am. We're looking for Jesse Carter." Jesse's breath caught. He shot to his feet so fast his chair scraped loud against the floor. Martha glanced back at him, confusion tightening the lines around her eyes, then unlatched the door and pulled it open. There they stood, framed in the soft golden light of dawn. Samuel in a clean pressed shirt and vest, his hat in his hands. Rose in a simple but well-made dress, her gray hair pinned neatly beneath a bonnet. They looked different somehow, steadier, more certain. Rose's face softened the moment she saw Jesse. "There you are, dear." Martha looked between them and Jesse, her confusion deepening. I don't understand. Who are you?" Samuel stepped forward slightly, his expression kind but serious. "Ma'am, your son did something remarkable yesterday. Something most folks wouldn't have had the courage to do." Jesse's pulse hammered in his ears. "How did you find me?" "The sheriff's office gave us your name and where you lived," Rose said gently. "After they returned our pouch." Martha's eyes widened. "Your pouch." Samuel nodded. "We lost it at the Silver Spur. And your boy, he not only paid for our meal when we couldn't, but he found our money and turned it in. Didn't keep a cent for himself." Martha's hand went to her mouth. She turned to look at Jesse, her eyes glistening. Rose took a step closer, her gaze warm but piercing. "We didn't come all the way out here just to say thank you, though that's part of it." She glanced at Samuel, who nodded. "We came because we need to ask you something important." Jesse's throat tightened. "Ask me what?" Samuel's voice was steady, deliberate. "How would you and your mother feel about a fresh start?" The words hung in the air like something fragile, something Jesse was afraid to touch in case it shattered. A fresh start. He stared at Samuel and Rose, searching their faces for some sign that this was a joke, some cruel trick played by people who had too much and didn't understand what it was like to have nothing. But there was only kindness in their eyes, certainty. Martha's voice came out quiet, careful, like she was afraid to hope. I don't understand what you're saying." Rose smiled gently and gestured toward the small wooden chairs around the table. "May we sit?" Martha nodded quickly, stepping aside. "Of course, please." They moved inside, and Jesse felt the walls of the tiny house close in around them. The cracked floorboards, the faded curtains, the stack of overdue notices on the desk in the corner. It all felt suddenly exposed, laid bare under their gaze. Samuel and Rose settled into the chairs, and Samuel's eyes swept across the room. Not with judgment, but with understanding. The kind of look that said he'd seen this before, that he knew what struggle looked like. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured. "We know what you're going through." Jesse's jaw tightened. "How?" Rose folded her hands in her lap. "Because we asked around, dear. After Jesse helped us yesterday, we wanted to know more about the young man who'd sacrificed so much for two strangers." Samuel nodded. "Your friend Tommy at the Silver Spur, he told us about you, Jesse. About how you've been working every odd job you can find to help your mother. How you save every penny. How you go without so she can have a little more." His gaze softened. "How you never ask for anything, even when you're starving." Jesse felt heat rise to his face. He looked down at his boots, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He wasn't used to people noticing, wasn't used to people caring. Martha's voice trembled. "Why would you do all this? Why would you go looking for information about us?" Rose's smile deepened, something knowing flickering behind her eyes. Because, my dear, we aren't just an old couple who lost their money. A beat of silence. Samuel leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. The truth is, Mrs. Carter, my wife and I are quite wealthy. Jesse's breath stalled in his chest. He blinked, his mind struggling to catch up with the words. We own one of the largest cattle ranches in the territory, Samuel continued, his tone even, as if he were discussing the weather. The Thornton Ranch. Maybe you've heard of it. Martha's hand flew to her chest. Her eyes went wide. The Thornton Ranch? You're those Thorntons? Samuel nodded. We are. Jesse felt like the ground had just dropped out from under him. The Thornton Ranch was legendary. Everyone in Dust Creek knew the name. It stretched for miles, employed dozens of men, supplied beef to half the territory. They weren't just rich, they were powerful. And they were sitting in his kitchen. Rose's voice pulled him back. We don't usually tell people right away. It complicates things. People treat us differently when they know. She looked at Jesse, her gaze piercing but kind. But last night, we met a boy who didn't hesitate to give up everything he had to help two strangers. A boy who expected nothing in return. And that, Jesse, is rare. Samuel's expression grew serious, his eyes locking onto Jesse's. We've spent our lives building something, but we've also spent our lives looking for people worth investing in. People with character, heart. He paused. People like you. Martha's voice was barely a whisper. What are you saying? Rose reached across the table, her weathered hand resting gently on Martha's. We're saying we want to help. A real home, stable work, a chance for Jesse to get a proper education, to have opportunities he deserves. She looked at Jesse. And for you, Mrs. Carter, work that pays you what you're worth. No more struggling. No more sleepless nights worrying about the bank. Jesse's heart pounded so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Jesse's throat tightened. The weight of their words pressed down on him like a physical thing, something he could barely breathe under. He looked at his mother, saw the way her hands trembled in her lap, saw the disbelief and hope warring in her eyes. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like them. Why? Jesse's voice came out rough, strained. Why would you do this for us? You don't even know us. Samuel leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands folded calmly in front of him. We know enough. His eyes held steady on Jesse's. We know that when faced with a choice between keeping the last bit of money you had or helping two people in need, you chose kindness. We know that you carried that pouch all the way to the sheriff's office instead of pocketing what was inside. And believe me, son, most men wouldn't have done that. Rose nodded, her voice soft but firm. We know that you've been carrying a burden no 15-year-old should have to carry, that you've been putting your mother's needs before your own, going hungry so she can eat, working yourself to exhaustion just to keep a roof over both your heads. She paused, her eyes glistening. That tells us everything we need to know about who you are. Martha's voice cracked. But this is too much. We can't possibly accept. Can't you? Samuel's tone wasn't unkind, but there was a weight to it. His gaze swept around the small room again. The peeling paint, the threadbare curtains, the stack of notices from the bank that neither of them had been able to ignore. Or is it just hard to believe that someone wants to help? Silence settled over the room like dust. Jesse's chest ached. He thought about the nights his mother had cried quietly in the next room, thinking he couldn't hear. He thought about the meals she'd skipped, the lies she'd told about not being hungry. He thought about the way she'd looked at him last night when he told her he'd given away their last dollar. Not with anger, but with a sadness so deep it had cut him to the bone. He thought about the future that had been closing in on them, slow and inevitable, the bank taking the house, his mother forced to find work in another town, him having to leave school, having to grow up even faster than he already had. And now these two strangers were offering them a way out. What if we say no? Jesse's voice was barely above a whisper. Rose smiled, the kind of smile that held no judgment, only understanding. Then we shake your hands, we thank you again for what you did, and we leave. No strings, no expectations, no hard feelings. Samuel nodded. This isn't charity, son. It's gratitude, and maybe something more. A chance to pass on the kind of help we once received ourselves when we needed it most. Martha looked at Jesse, her eyes searching his face. Her hand reached out and found his, squeezing it tight. Baby, she whispered, her voice trembling, you don't have to carry this alone anymore. Jesse felt something crack inside him, something that had been holding him together for too long. His eyes burned, his throat closed up. He wanted to say something, wanted to find the words, but they wouldn't come. He thought about what his mother had said last night. We've got each other, and we've got a son who knows what it means to be good. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had always been enough. But now they were being offered more, a chance, a future, hope. Jesse looked at Samuel and Rose, at the quiet certainty in their faces, at the kindness that didn't waver. He looked at his mother, at the tears streaming down her cheeks, at the way she was barely holding herself together. And then he looked down at their joined hands, his and his mother's, worn and calloused from years of hard work and harder choices. He took a breath, let it out slow. Then he looked up and met Samuel's eyes. Okay, Jesse said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Okay. The word hung in the air for a moment, small but impossibly heavy. Okay. Rose's face broke into a warm smile, her eyes brightening with something that looked like relief. Samuel nodded slowly, a look of quiet satisfaction settling over his weathered features. Good, Samuel said simply. He rose from his chair, extending his hand toward Jesse. Then let's get started. Jesse stood and took his hand. Samuel's grip was firm, steady, the handshake of a man who kept his word. When he released Jesse's hand, Rose stood and pulled him into a gentle embrace, the kind that reminded him of grandmothers he'd only read about in books. You're a good boy, Jesse Carter, she whispered. Don't ever forget that. Martha wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. Samuel turned to her, his expression kind but businesslike. Mrs. Carter, we'll need a few days to make arrangements. We have a foreman's cottage on the ranch that's been sitting empty. It's yours if you want it. 3 rooms, a proper kitchen, and a well that doesn't run dry in summer. He paused, letting the words sink in. In the meantime, I'll speak with the bank about your current situation. Whatever's owed, we'll handle it. Martha's hand went to her throat. Mr. Thornton, I don't know what to say. Say you'll let us help, Rose said gently. Say you'll give yourself and your son a chance at something better. Martha's voice broke. Thank you. Thank you both. Samuel nodded, then reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. He counted out several bills, more money than Jesse had seen in his entire life, and set them on the table. For now, Samuel said, get yourselves some proper meals. Buy whatever you need. We'll come back in 3 days with a wagon to help you move your things. Jesse stared at the money, his heart pounding. It felt surreal, like a dream he was afraid to wake up from. Rose moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Jesse? He looked up. We're going to need good men at the ranch. Men we can trust. Men with character. Her smile deepened. I have a feeling you'll fit right in. Samuel tipped his hat to Martha, then to Jesse. 3 days then. Dawn. And with that, they stepped out into the morning light. Jesse and Martha stood in the doorway, watching as Samuel and Rose climbed into a well-kept wagon hitched to 2 strong horses. Samuel took the reins, Rose settled beside him, and with a gentle snap, the horses started forward, pulling them down the dusty road back toward town. Jesse and Martha stood there long after the wagon had disappeared from sight, the morning sun climbing higher, painting the dry land in shades of gold. Finally, Martha turned to her son. She cupped his face in her hands, her eyes red but shining with something Jesse hadn't seen in a long time. "Hope. You did this," she whispered. "You saved us." Jesse shook his head. "I just did what was right." "Exactly." Martha pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him tight. "And that's why we're going to be okay now. Because you have a good heart, baby. The kind of heart that changes lives." Jesse closed his eyes and let himself sink into his mother's embrace. For the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The future didn't look like a wall closing in anymore. It looked like an open road stretching out ahead of them. 3 days later, when the sun rose over the Carter homestead, Samuel and Rose returned with a wagon just as promised. Jesse and Martha loaded what little they owned: clothes, a few cooking pots, a photograph of Jesse's father, and climbed aboard. As the wagon rolled toward the Thornton ranch, Jesse looked back one last time at the small, weathered house that had been their prison and their refuge. Then he turned forward, toward the horizon, toward the life waiting for them. And for the first time in a long time, Jesse Carter smiled.